Hey, what's up folks? Today I'm going to be reviewing another game from Patreon, and in today's game we're going to see white face off against the Dragodorf variation, which is where black plays both g6 in the dragon, of course, and a6, so combining the dragon and the Najdorf Sicilians. And we're going to see actually a pretty typical battle and give us a chance to discuss this variation a bit, give you my thoughts on it, and how I think white should handle this one. So this game was submitted by Dan, aka Sriracha, who's playing white here against Kyle B. And this was played in actually the Dojo Verified Classical Tournament with a time control of G45 plus 30. So we get the Sicilian, white plays the open Sicilian, knight f6, knight c3, g6, black goes for the dragon, white plays bishop e3. The starting point, of course, of the famous Yugoslav attack, white plays f3, queen d2, and castles queenside. Black goes bishop g7, f3, and now plays a6. And yeah, this is a pretty interesting system, especially when it first came into popularity a few years ago. White players didn't really know what to do against this one. And yeah, it can definitely take an open Sicilian player out of their comfort zone if they've never really figured out what to do against this opening. Because black's idea is essentially to play a dragon, but not to castle early in most cases, where white just gets this like very easy attack with queen d2, g4, h4, h5, and so on. But rather black's point is to keep the king in the center for quite some time while they get their queenside counterplay going with b5, knight d7, knight c5, bishop b7, and so on. So black tries to get their play going on the queen side, and then at some point will castle kingside, maybe even playing h5 at some point to slow white down. And yeah, basically taking the game away from like a very theoretical dragon to one where neither side is on familiar territory. Now, lately, this one has actually been seen a little bit more at the top levels, especially in Blitz. I think it's seen a little bit of a resurgence. Here, white plays queen d2, which is the main move, and black plays b5, which is kind of the older way of playing this one, and I think actually really not the most accurate way for black in this position, because this quick b5 allows white to play a4. Now, in the game white goes g4, I think a4 here is actually the way to punish this one. And I actually remember including this one in my book on the Open Sicilian, which I co-wrote with international master Zhanibek Amanov. I remember discovering this one way back when this line was first coming into fashion, and yeah, I think I checked it recently, and to this day, white seems to be doing pretty well here. Because the point is, black is just kind of underdeveloped to fight on the queen side. After b4, white goes knight a2, hitting the pawn, and if black wants to defend this one, they have to play a5, but that gives up the b5 square. White can go ahead and plant the bishop on b5, play c3 here, and again, if black doesn't want to lose the pawn, they have to take on c3. White can recapture with the knight, and in general, white is usually very comfortable in this kind of position because we have good control over the b5 square, 2 versus 1 on the queen side in the long run, and yeah, black doesn't really have great counterplay here. So this is still kind of the way to punish this one. Nowadays, what a lot of players are doing is they're playing h5 in this position, which is a really interesting move, just stopping white from playing g4, not letting white get this typical kingside pawn storm. And even Magnus has had a couple of games recently in Online Rapid where he's tried this out against really strong opponents and has done quite okay. So definitely this is still very much a very fighting opening and lots of territory to be explored here. Now in this game we get queen d2, b5, white plays g4, which is a thematic move. And this would be the move to play, let's say black played just like knight d7 here. Then I quite like a move like g4 here, or queenside castling and then g4. And this is how I think white should kind of play in general in this line. Very aggressively g4, h4, castle queenside, put the king on b1, h5. Basically, you got to go after black and really try to fight for the initiative here. And that's why it makes black's h5 move all the more interesting, is that it stops white from playing g4, and then black can continue with their development. So b5 is played, white goes g4, which I think is not a bad move, but again, a4 would have been a little bit stronger. Bishop b7, queenside castling. Now black goes knight c6. And yeah, knight c6 is kind of a controversial move in these kinds of positions. It's not clear if black really wants to trade these knights off so easily. And here, I think the real problem is that after white goes knight takes c6, as happens in the game, black plays bishop takes c6. Black kind of blocks off the c file for the rook, and their counterplay is slowed down a bit. So yeah, I don't like knight c6 here from black. I think h5 was probably the main way to go. And I looked at this position. I think there are still some games here, and I think there are some games with h5, g5, knight fd7, white plays f4, and white is a little bit better. White is fighting for the initiative, but of course, very, very double-edged position. If b4 going after the e4 pawn, white is probably playing knight to d5, and yeah, really just high-stakes position for both sides. So yeah, knight c6 allows white to take, bishop takes e6, and now white plays knight to e2. Really a typical plan, knight e2 trying to bring the knight to d4. I don't think it quite works in this position because if black were to play h5 here, which is again a thematic move, like black would really like to play h5 in a lot of these positions to slow down white's kingside, then after g5, let's say knight d7, white isn't able to play f4 because this knight is needed on c3 to defend the e4 pawn. And because white isn't able to play f4, that means black's knight gets this fantastic e5 square. The knight can then jump to c4, and I think black is just getting really, really decent play here. So knight e2, it kind of works out in this game. In general, it's not a bad idea to kind of transfer the knight to d4. I don't think it was quite the way to go here. I really like this move, bishop d4, actually, in this position. There are other moves as well, like king b1, h4, they make sense. But I really would have liked to see bishop d4 here because that actually prevents black from playing h5, which is kind of an interesting point. So this is the only move where now h5 it would be, of course, a big blunder because of g5. And if black can't play h5 in this position, then I think white is quite comfortable. So for example, let's say black castles, white can go ahead and play knight to d5. This is a pretty thematic idea in the dragon. The point is to try to trade off some pieces. If black takes with the knight, then we can either take here first, or take on g7, I think is also fine, and then take on d5, and then white is playing h4, h5 very quickly. The queen can come to d4 with tempo, and this is just a great version of this kind of opposite sides castling position where both sides are attacking. I think white is just way ahead here, and we've traded off the fianchettoed bishop, and so white's chances just look incredible in something like this. And okay, if black doesn't castle and play something like rook to c8, white can continue like king to b1, h4 here, but the point is that black isn't really able to deal with white's kingside play so easily without having this h5 resource. Sooner or later, black is going to have to castle, and then white is just advancing with the attack as usual, h4, h5. Queen is opened up to use the h2 square at some point, and yeah, white's attacking chances look pretty nice. So in the game, we see knight e2, rook c8, knight to d4. Bishop to b7, and like I mentioned, I think black should have played h5 earlier, but instead plays rook to c8. Now I think white is doing quite well again, and here white goes for bishop h6. Another very thematic move, but maybe not the right moment for this one. I'm really not sure. Now I think what black should have done at this point is castle. And probably what black was afraid of, and maybe what white had in mind, was to take on g7, or maybe play h4 first. I think it doesn't make a huge difference because after takes in h4, black cannot play h5. This is kind of an important point because white can take here. After knight takes, white has this trick with knight f5 check, and this is just devastating for black. Either queen h6 is coming, or g takes f5, queen g5. Black's kingside just collapses and black gets mated. But what black can do is play e5, and this is kind of black's main resource in the position, but this is a hard move to play because once white moves the knight away, it looks like d6 is hanging, but really it's not so simple. Black plays queen to c7 here, and I think the position is pretty double-edged. Black has pressure against c2, the rook can come to d8, black can play for the d5 break. White still has their kingside play as well, but yeah, I think both sides pretty much have their chances. So this was the way for black to go, but I can definitely understand not wanting to deal with this kind of attack. And instead, black decides to trade on h6. And now after queen takes h6, now I think white is doing quite well. And a lot of players do this. They trade on h6 and they bring the enemy queen in. And there's no real danger to the king right away. The queen isn't going to do anything. But the problem with this one is simply that black now just can't castle. And so the king is on e8, the rook is on h8, white can just connect the rooks here and stand very, very well. Now bishop h6 wasn't the only way for white to play here. I think there are a couple decent options. I should just mention h4, king to b1, where I think white keeps a nice little advantage. Bishop h6 is definitely interesting, but yeah, after castles that certainly would have been a very double-edged position. So in the game we get takes, and queen a5, but white just plays king to b1, and yeah, black doesn't really have enough counterplay here, because again, white is just developing, the rooks are going to get connected, and if black can't castle, then this rook on h8 just is never getting in the game. So queen c7, so losing some time as white just got to play king b1 for free. And now rook to d2 from white, and yeah, really one of a couple, maybe let's call them questionable moves. I didn't really get this one. In the notes, Dan writes that, yeah, he was thinking about this one and rook to c1, and really just didn't like bishop to d3 because it apparently breaks the connection between the rook and the knight. And yeah, it's kind of a strange note. I mean, I thought, for me, bishop d3 is like the most natural move in the position by far. Not only do we cover c2, which is kind of like our main weakness, we also cover e4, which later becomes a weakness, but is often, a weak point in e4 positions, not just the Sicilian, but just e4 in general. The e4 point can be pretty weak. And connecting rooks, right? And just showing that white has one main advantage here, which is that the rooks are connected. Black's rook is still stuck on h8. And yeah, I think white is just unquestionably better here. And it's quite unpleasant for black, I think, because yeah, I mean, if you can't connect your rooks, your king is just stuck in the center. At a certain point, things are going to open up. And yeah, now black has just zero counterplay on c2. So I do think this was definitely the easy move to make. We play rook to d2. Now black plays e5. Definitely a very good practical try because black can castle, so black needs to create some drama, some counterplay. And here actually it's a very interesting moment for white because there's lots and lots of interesting options. If you'd like, you can pause the video and think for yourself how you think white should continue here, because I think it's really not that clear, but again, lots and lots of interesting choices. Okay, so there's a couple of safe moves and then a couple of let's say sharp moves. The safe moves are knight b3 and knight to e2. I think after either of these moves, white is definitely better. They both have their drawbacks, so we can talk about them. Now it seems like Dan made some miscalculations here. So he writes that knight b3 a5 is no fun for white, but the b5 pawn is just hanging with check, and I think Dan just missed that in his notes. Because indeed, if white can't take on b5, then yeah, this is pretty annoying. a5, a4, a3, that's not really fun. But since white can take on b5, then this is just not a thing for black. Now black can maybe spend the tempo with bishop to c6 to try and defend this one, but this is really takes a long time and then blocks the pieces on the c file as well. So after knight b3, I think white is clearly better, and then we can develop the bishop, get the second rook to d1, maybe bishop e2, and yeah, once again, I think white is doing well. Knight e2 is also okay for white, although I have to be a little bit careful here, right? Because white is behind in development. I think black should try something like d5 just to create some counterplay while white hasn't fully developed here. And yeah, if white is not careful, I think black is going to overtake the initiative. But if white continues actively with something like bishop h3, or let's say g5 first and then bishop h3, getting the second rook in the game, then I think white would be doing quite well here. So this was, again, another good option. Now there's a couple of sharp options that might be okay, but yeah, have to be followed up pretty precisely. Now Dan correctly notes that queen to g7 here would not be good in view of king e7, where black just defends the knight, defends the rook, and it's not clear what white's queen is doing. In fact, it might even get trapped at some point, like h5 or h6. So if there's no follow-up checks, anything like this, then yeah, this isn't going to be working for white. So queen g7 is no good. Interesting option is bishop takes b5. Actually, I don't think this was included in Dan's notes, so I don't know if he considered this one, but this is definitely an interesting try, just sacrificing the bishop for 2 pawns immediately, but then knight takes b5 hits the queen and hits the pawn on d6. But the issue with this one is not if black takes the piece, because then indeed white is just getting a ton of material for the bishop and is doing extremely well. Instead, the problem would be if black just ignores this one again with a really strong move, king to e7, where, okay, white snagged the pawn with check, but now has two minor pieces hanging, and it's not clear that white's going to be able to get enough for the piece here. So this position would be pretty unclear. And then we also have this move g5, which I think was worth considering as well. Because we hit the knight on f6, the knight doesn't really want to move anywhere. But we also open up the bishop to this h3 square, which would be pretty useful to get black's rook off of c8, kind of ease up some of the pressure on c2. And of course, once again, opening up white's rook to finally develop to d1. So g5 was an interesting choice. I think white is doing very well here, but again, position remains sharp. And finally, we have the move played in the game, knight f5. Which I think concretely does work, but again, has to be followed up precisely. Now, the main idea behind this move, of course, it's hitting d6. If black takes immediately, then after queen takes f6, black's position is kind of collapsing here. d6 is hanging, the rook is hanging, and yeah, black just doesn't have enough here. But the move itself has to be followed up precisely because black finds a really strong response. Knight takes e4. And now what's happening is black is basically doing a desperado sacrifice, giving the piece for some material before taking on f5. And black's idea is if white takes on e4, at least it seems like black's idea would be to take on f5 and then go into this position, which looks similar to the previous one, except here black is getting more counterplay with bishop coming to e4. Now in the game, after f takes e4, this was played, black just played the immediate bishop takes e4, huge blunder. White goes knight takes d6 check, hitting the king, hitting the bishop, and that's just immediately lost. If the king moves, then knight takes c4, black has nothing for the two pieces. So black tried queen takes d6, rook takes c2, but okay, this is just one threat of a discovered attack, easily covered with bishop to d3, and white was able to win the game, no problem. So kind of an unfortunate end for black there. They definitely could have kept the game very, very complicated because after g takes f5, Dan writes in his notes that his plan was to play queen to f6, which looks very good for white. Once again, everything is hanging. I should note queen takes d6 here is not great. After takes, bishop takes e4. We kind of see the problem in white's position. Once the e4 pawn falls, c2 is hanging and the rook is hanging. So queen takes d6 is no good. Queen f6 was going to be white's move. But here after bishop takes e4, the position is actually extremely sharp. Now it's kind of amazing that white can actually take a rook here with check. But after queen takes h8, king to e7, the queen is hanging, but also the rook on h1 is hanging, and the pawn on c2 is hanging, which once black takes this one, this is actually going to give black back rank ideas on the c-file. So for example, okay, queen is hanging on h8, let's say queen takes h7, bishop takes c2 check, black doesn't even take the rook, black takes this one, king a1, bishop back to e4, and now there's just too many threats in the position, and white is actually just lost. So this would have turned the game into one that's just extremely complicated, and yeah, then all three results would have been possible. So although objectively this move, knight f5, is strong, it wasn't quite followed up correctly. Now, the key point here was that after knight takes e4, white recaptured f takes e4, but had a chance to play knight to g7 check. So this is the key idea that white misses, that he can actually save the knight with tempo. Knight doesn't look great on g7, but it's still on the board. After, let's say, king d7, f takes e4, Dan writes in the notes that during the game, he was only considering rook to g1 here, where indeed, yeah, things are very, very messy. There's bishop takes c2, there's queen c5 is included in the notes, and yeah, in fact, white is, I think, in a little bit of trouble here after bishop takes c2. Instead, bishop g2 needed to be found, which I think is not the hardest move to see. It is a tough one, or one that is very possible to miss. But again, it's also a very natural move because we're, okay, dealing with the threat on the rook, of course, but more importantly, opening up the rook on the back rank. So it looks scary, but nothing here actually works for black. Takes, king a1. If bishop e4, white can take it and is covering the back rank. So this was the way for white to actually win. After knight f5, this was missed. White takes on e4. Black could have taken this one, and then the game would have been super messy. Instead, blunders with bishop takes e4, knight d6, and the game was over. So quite a number of complications. I think just this one moment after e5 is really, really interesting, just because there's a number of options here for white, but none of them are, let's say, 100% perfect. It's just a matter of choosing one and being able to follow up accurately here. But I thought it was quite interesting, a lot of these complications, and how black surprisingly has a ton of counterplay even though the king is on e8. Now, I don't have a huge lesson that ties all these moves and lines together. I think it was just an interesting game with a number of points where both sides could have improved. But hopefully it was an interesting lecture in terms of how to play against the Dragodorf Sicilian, especially with this a4 idea, as well as these ideas of playing g4, h4. And yeah, hopefully you learned some interesting points about how to play these typical Sicilian middle games in general. All right, guys, that's going to wrap it up for this video. If you enjoyed it, please let us know in the comments below, and do leave a thumbs up on the video. We really do appreciate it. And also make sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. That's going to do it. Hopefully you have a great rest of your day, and I'll catch you next time. Take care.